Welcome to the D-Spot podcast. Dr. Dana McNeil is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in working with couples using the Gottman method. Her evidence-based practice provides support for the wide range of relationship issues that modern couples face. By using her open, affirming, and outside-of-the-box thinking, Dr. Dana is able to approach her work with couples by bringing both insights and tools that reflect the realities of today's complicated relationships. Dr. Dana features guests on her podcast that include a unique array of celebrities, CEOs, influencers, and everyday folks who are all working on navigating new conversations about how society views what goes into a successful relationship. And now, here's your host, Dr. Dana McNeil.
Hello, and welcome to the D-Spot podcast. I am Dr. Dana McNeil, and I'm your host for a podcast that is all about relationships and the people in them. Our goal in this show is to change the conversation about going to couples therapy and explore what defines a healthy relationship. Today, I am excited to introduce you to Katherine Miller. Katherine is an attorney on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. Love that. She's the founder of the Miller Law Group and a director and trainer with the Center for Understanding and Conflict. She's been working in the field of family law for more than 35 years. She does not look like it at all. She is also a mediator. She hosts a radio podcast show called Divorce Dialogues. She's the co-author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, A Cup of Coffee, with 10 of the top divorce attorneys in the United States, and the author of the New Yorker's Guide to Collaborative Divorce. She's been on many media appearances, CBS, NBC, New York Times. I could go on and on. I am thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So, how did you decide to become a specialist in divorce? Because I know you probably are like, yeah, I'm going to be an attorney. How did you decide the divorce part?
Well, I'll give you the shorter story, but I went to law school because I was interested in justice. And I realized in the orientation week, that is not what law school was going to be about. And frankly, that's not what the law is mostly about either. That's another story for another podcast, maybe. I come from a family of therapists, actually, and I've always been really interested in people. I always thought I was too bossy to be a therapist, so family law was perfect.
Well, I think probably to be a good divorce attorney, you would have to have some therapist in you, or your clients aren't going to resonate that you're having empathy for them. And I imagine that that's a big part of being a divorce attorney.
I think it should be.
Good answer. Okay. So when I was doing my bio reading and kind of learning about you, you've gone through your own divorce, which is probably comforting for your clients. Is that something that they resonate, that you get their world and that makes sense, that you would have an understanding of what it's like for them?
Yeah, I do. I think it is comforting, but it's also true that it should be comforting in some way, because I think, honestly, if I could just take you down a walk down memory lane, for me anyway, a little bit. I told you why I went to law school and why I became a family lawyer. And I really figured out after about 2 years of practicing, that there really had to be a better way to help these families resolve conflict, because the courtroom is just a very bad place for families. And ask any court, any judge who sits in a family court or in the divorce court, they'll tell you that they're really not the best place to resolve that kind of conflict. And I took up my first mediation training, and I started to try to integrate those mediative ideas of settling based on the criteria that were important to the people going through the divorce or going through whatever family conflict they had. And in every single case, I ran into the same problem, and that problem was the other lawyer. And again, Dana, it wasn't like they were bad lawyers, not at all, or bad people, certainly not. It's just that we could not get on the same page about what criteria we were going to use to help these people resolve the disagreements and the conflicts that they had. After about 10 years of that, I got divorced myself, as we're talking about, and I realized personally, not just professionally, what it was like to sit in the client chair, and how frustrating and disorienting and hijacking of your life and anxiety provoking, and you can fill in a number of these kinds of adjectives and descriptors. And so I thought, I don't think I can do this anymore. and I quit my job. And I thought, I'm going to have to do something besides being a lawyer. I don't know why I couldn't figure out to try to change to another area of law, but that's what I thought at the time. And then I took another mediation training and I took a collaborative training. And I thought, you know what? I think that we can do this in a different way. I think that we can really focus on the client's personal criteria. Obviously, we're not forgetting the law. We are lawyers. We deal with the law. But if we're trying to put together these ideas of where does the law meet the person, meet the family, meet the kids, and try to come to a resolution. And I think not just try, but actually work toward fashioning a resolution that makes sense, not just from a legal perspective, but makes sense from a personal, family, relational perspective as well. And that is, I think, really where my own personal experience comes into a real determination to try to do this in a way that's family focused, if that makes sense to you.
It does. That's rich. There was so much in there. The first thing that I heard is something that I heard on your website. It's a process of not getting what you want, but what you need. Right? Is that kind of like the approach that you learned from your own self, and then you've kind of brought that into the work that you're doing with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, you could come into a divorce, want a lot of things, right? And you want to be recognized and you want to be validated and justified. And, there's a lot of stuff that it maybe isn't going to happen. But then there's stuff that you really do need. Where are you going? What are your dreams? What are your hopes? What are you trying to do with the rest of your life? What are you trying to do professionally? What are you trying to do personally? How do you want to be with your children? And how do you want to co-parent with your ex-spouse, these children who still see you as family? And what do you want to do about that? And I think really getting focused on what I think of as being those most important things and less on the things that are very distracting and can feel quite urgent in the minute. I can't believe he said that. Can you believe she flew here on a broomstick? Like, those are the kinds of things that ultimately you might want them, but they don't really do anything for you and they don't get you anywhere in life.
I love this idea that your divorce is a milestone and how you take the next step of your journey is up to you, and you can set it up for success by how you handle this time. Right? Because that's such a lovely, very therapeutic reframe, right? It's because so much of us are like, that's horrible. I'm a failure. There's only dread. This is something that is like walking to the guillotine versus like, this is a thing that's happening. And we can either make it like a positive event where we're modeling for our children what healthy relationships look like, even when they come to an end, or we can just perpetuate this negativity that is not going to serve you and certainly not doing any wonders for your family.
Yeah. And for your listeners, I want to be clear that it's what healthy people do when things go wrong, because you might be thinking, a listener might be thinking, well, I could do that, but my ex, no way. There's no way I can get that person to be in a healthy relationship. You can do this yourself and demonstrate to your children yourself how healthy people act when they're going through difficult times, right? I mean, it can be divorce, it could be illness, it could be death of a loved one, it could be having to move. There are a lot of super stressful things that happen in our lives. And if you think about it from a proactive perspective, what can I do to build, create, and construct the life that I want to lead, even in the face of adversity? And what can I show to my children about that? I think that's really, really powerful. And one of the things that I like to ask my clients is, how would you want your children to describe you going through this later on in life?
Beautiful.
I think that's a really powerful reframe and something that was really helpful to me, because believe me, I'm not perfect. And I spent a lot of, let me just tell you that when I was getting divorced, I realized when I was thinking about killing my ex-husband, that I was thinking about how I would get rid of the body, that was probably letting myself get too far down that road, and that wasn't going to be healthy for any of us, least of all me. And so I stopped myself from doing that and realized that wouldn't be good for my kids. And frankly, it wouldn't be good for me, even if it was something that I might have.
And you'd have another set of legal issues. So yeah, that wouldn't be a good thing. I do want to ask you about that though, because so in the therapy world, when I'm having some feelings about something that's happening in the room, we call it transference. transference, right? So if I were going through a divorce and I had a client that was going through a divorce, I could experience transference, right? How did you handle that? Because that's your job and you were going through that thing. What was your way of coping with it?
Well, I think therapy is a good thing for everybody, lawyers as well. And I think to have an appropriate place to explore your feelings and talk about what's going on. I think sweeping it under the rug and pretending it's not there is unrealistic and not possible, right? So that if you try to sweep it under the rug, it's going to find its way out around the corners through the fringe, right? And so that's how I dealt with it, is I talked about it. I let myself have the feelings and I let myself let them go as well. And I tried, it was a long time ago. I got divorced in 99. And so, I don't think it comes back in, much anymore because it's old news. But I do recognize the feelings that people have, Dana, and I recognize the impulses that they have. And I know what it feels like to be there. I know it's really hard. And I also know that it's not some place that anyone is really going to get stuck, that they're going to find a way through it. And if they give themselves the support that they need to do that in the best possible way, it's going to be an easier, smoother process.
What should somebody look for when they're interviewing their divorce attorney, or what kind of traits or personality styles is going to set them up to have a good experience?
Well, it's similar to choosing a therapist. I think there should be a good match in terms of, I don't know if you'd call it chemistry, but it should be that you feel like that the lawyer hears you and hears what's going on for you and isn't either just yesing you to death or telling you can't have that, right? So you want someone who is really going to be able to listen to where you are, explain things to you, doesn't always talk in legalese. I mean, I talk to a lot of people who are like, well, who are like friends of clients of mine from out of state. I could never represent these people because they live in other states. And they're like, well, I think this is what's going on with my lawyer, or I can't really talk to my lawyer about that. And I'm like, that is not a good thing to happen. You want to have someone who you feel like you can tell stuff to, who's going to be responsive, and is going to be responsive in a way that makes sense to you. Maybe you don't get everything you want, but you should be able to understand why not and what you're going to get instead. That's one thing. Another thing is, in New York, 97% of divorces settle before a judge makes a decision after a trial. And nationwide, that statistic is 95%. 95%.
Wow.
Likelihood that you're going to settle rather than go through to a trial and having a judge or jury make a decision. So when you think about the skills that you want your lawyer to have, sure, you want a good lawyer who knows the law and can argue if you have to go to court, but you really want a good negotiator. You want someone who really understands what it is to negotiate outside the courtroom and who can do that in an effective way, focused on what's important to you, the client, not necessarily what's important to a judge. So that's often not the same thing. And I think that's something that you want to make sure that the lawyer has as well.
So you want to settle before going to court. Obviously, it's more expensive. It's more emotionally draining. It pulls it out longer. And that means that if the attorney is saying, hey, we should go to court, that should be raising a red flag for you.
I mean, it depends on the situation.
Okay.
But, there are certain times if you've got someone who just refuses to be responsive, going to court doesn't necessarily mean you're going to trial. So you might need to go to court because some people need the discipline of the court system, but even so, it's very unlikely that you're going to go to trial. I think it should raise a red flag for you if your lawyer is saying, let's go to trial from the very beginning, because like statistically speaking, it's really unlikely. So let's think about that. So if you're getting on the litigation train, and sometimes you have to, I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do necessarily, but your lawyer is doing two things, right? Two things. One is preparing for trial, and that's expensive and it's time consuming and it's very disorienting because then you're working in the time frame that's the court's time. You come to the court conferences when the court says, and you have hearings when the court says, and the discovery schedule, and discovery is what we call information gathering in the law. So the information gathering is again on a schedule that's dictated by the court's standards. So all of that has to happen. And a good lawyer, of course, is going to do that, because in the 5% chance that you end up in trial, you've got to be prepared. So absolutely that. But at the same time, they're trying to settle, right? And the tenor of those settlement conversations obviously could be a little different than the tenor of the trial prep conversations. And so the lawyer and her firm are doing two things to move your case forward. And those two things can be in conflict with each other. So if you can get further along in the settlement discussions before you get on the litigation track, if you can, and not everybody can, it doesn't make people bad people or wrong or the lawyer's bad or anything like that. But if it's possible because of the situation, then I think that that's probably the most effective thing, as long as it keeps moving forward. If it gets stalled out, and frankly, when it gets complicated, it's usually the feelings and not the finances that make it complicated. If that happens, well, sometimes you have to make a little journey to someone who can push you through. But I think oftentimes if you've got some good negotiators in the room and you've got parties, you have a couple that really are willing to roll up their sleeves and work through it, then you can avoid that expense and that time and that, frankly, loss of control, which is something I certainly didn't want.
So would you say that that's sort of the number one reason that couples are messing up their divorce, is because they are coming from the emotional place versus this is unfortunately at this point, a business situation?
I think there are two mistakes that people make. And one is, I think of them as a how mistake, and the other is a what mistake. And so the how mistake is to not really research the process choices there are, right? So that oftentimes I think people find themselves in a divorce situation. They want to get divorced. Nobody feels good about it. It's a kind of shameful thing or an embarrassing thing or a very hurtful thing. And so they get a recommendation for a lawyer from a friend or family member, neighbor, coworker, and they go see that lawyer. And, one of my favorite expressions is, to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so if you go to a lawyer who is a litigator, well, that's what you're going to get. You're going to hire that lawyer. It's going to feel good in the beginning, because you're going to feel like, oh my God, here's someone who's going to help me with my problem.
Hammer it through. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it really makes sense, I think, to do the research as to the mediation, look into collaborative law, look into the various choices in your area and talk to more than one lawyer, so that you can understand how the lawyers approach the situation and your situation differently, because everybody is different and lawyers are really different. And I remember talking to a potential client who became a client a few years ago, and she had just interviewed another lawyer I know, a lawyer I've referred people to in certain circumstances. I think she's terrific. And she said, wow, this is a really different interview than the one I did with, let's just call her Susan, because she was all law. And I was all, let's talk about you as a person, what's going on first, and then we can bring the law in and talk about that. So I think that that's a mistake people make. And it's understandable, because how would you know that lawyers are different and they see things differently, and in fact they work in different ways. And the other thing is, I think it's a mistake to say leave your feelings aside, because as a therapist I think you got to realize that's not super possible, right? Yeah. So I think my advice is to really, it's kind of like lean into your feelings enough to work through them, so that you're not dictated in a reactive way, and that you can actually go deep enough into your feelings to figure out what's really important to you. And so I think that advice, leave your feelings aside, is given from a good place of saying, don't allow your feelings to dictate your behavior. But the idea that you're going to be able to set your feelings aside, I think is just wrong. And I think, in fact, you would know this better than I, that the decision-making part of our brain is in the feeling part. So even when we're deciding which we're going to put the left sock on before the right sock or the other way around, that's a feeling decision. And, so basically we make decisions that we want about what we want to do, and then we rationalize it. So I think to really kind of understand your feelings and what's the deepest feeling, what's the most important thing, so that you can work through those reactive hurt feelings of betrayal, feelings of anxiety. And I was in my 40s before I realized that anxiety wasn't going to kill me. And I'm really not kidding about that. And what I mean is that when I would feel anxious and I would start like flailing around to do something that would make me feel less anxious. And people do that in their divorces, but I would almost always make a poor choice because I just wanted the anxiety to stop. And if I would really allow myself to feel the anxiety and really sort through what that anxiety was about and what was most important to me and what direction did I really want to take, if I can do that, then I'm going to make a really good decision, a proactive decision that is eventually going to assuage my anxiety, but isn't going to do it in a reactive way, more of a proactive way. Does that make sense to you?
Beautiful. I like to tell my clients, use those emotions to figure out what healthy boundaries you need to set. Right. So if I'm feeling something's unfair or it's unjust or I'm being taken advantage of, or I'm just like, this is a deal breaker to me, then great. If it's that you need to have shared custody of your child, fantastic. Make a healthy boundary about that. If you're just being argumentative about the Christmas tree that's in the attic that, you want to make sure stays with you because you feel like you have control, that's a different issue, right? So sorting out those feelings to help you set healthy boundaries is very different than reacting to every single thing that happens. Responding is the way that you want to work through those. So good. Yeah. I mean, I love that you're like, we're not going to get rid of feelings. So, I mean, it's lovely for you to notice that you have them and how can you sort them before you bring it into the situation, right? It's maybe you just need some time to process it and talk to your therapist about it or talk to your attorney about it. Is this really in the best, for me and what my goals are? Is this really the best approach for me? Right. And you guys being collaborative and working together. Beautiful. So kind of a shift. Is it a no-brainer for couples these days to get a prenup? Is that just like, what are you thinking? Of course, everybody should do that.
I think in part it depends where you live, because the laws from state to state vary about how much they are willing to enforce a prenup. And so I don't know that it's a great idea necessarily if you live in a state that doesn't put much weight into the prenups. But one thing I do think, Dana, is a really important thing for people is to have those conversations, whether or not you'll end up in signing a prenup or not. I'm in New York. New York does have very strong prenup rules, and I think it's a really good idea. And I think that, and here's why: every single marriage ends. It ends by death or divorce, right? And so the law has something to say about the end of a marriage both ways. And so you find that you have lawyers who work in family law, like myself, working in the prenup area because of the possibility that the marriage will end in divorce. And then you have trust and estates lawyers who deal with death and decedent's estates and things like that, dealing with what happens when the marriage ends because of death. And so I think there are really three categories of people who absolutely should have a prenup, and probably everybody should consider it. And those three areas of kinds of people are people who come from families of wealth, whose families are trying to maintain the stewardship of the family wealth through the generations and don't want it disturbed by the divorce law or by the laws that happen when people try to arrange their affairs for after their death. And a lot of times the families of those engaged couples are putting a lot of pressure on them, and that can feel really bad to everybody. The fiance of the family member can feel like he or she is not being trusted and not really being a partner and all that sort of stuff. And the child of the family can feel in a really uncomfortable position of being stuck between this loving relationship and their family of origin. And that is really uncomfortable. So I think it's a good idea to have those conversations if you can in a mediation session, because what ends up happening in that particular situation particularly is that the family member goes to the family lawyer And they have some uncomfortable conversations, a lot of which they're not paying attention to. I think of it's like Charlie Brown's parents, it's happening in their head because all these conversations are happening. And so the lawyer is saying things like, so waiving maintenance, right? Which was, or alimony, waiving alimony. Oh yeah, that sounds good. And they're just not listening. Like, they're just like, whatever. And the lawyer drafts it up like that and then lobs it into the inbox of the lawyer being hired by the fiance, being paid for by the family, the wealthy family, right? And then the fiance reads it and goes, oh my God, I can't believe it. And you're off to the races with hurt feelings. So I think that the prenup in that situation, or all situations, should do something for both parties. It shouldn't just take away, it should put into place a substitute, and that those can be loving conversations because it makes sense. I think that a lot of people spend more time talking about the color of the napkins at the wedding reception than they do about how they're going to handle money during their marriage. And as we know, I'm sure you know, that money, I'm not sure it's the reason, but it sure is a common area of friction and conflict in marriages. And if you didn't talk before you got married about how you're going to pay household bills, what about working after you have children, right? What about credit? We had a client come in and get divorced just a few months after she got married because when her new husband found out how much credit card debt she had, he didn't want to be married to her anymore. I mean, wouldn't it be better to have that conversation before you get married? And so these are difficult conversations that could be facilitated in the prenup conversation in a way that really set the marriage up for success, instead of the cynical view that a prenup is planning for the end before it's even begun. So just quickly, I think the other kinds of people who should really think about it are people who are getting married a little later in life, who have already amassed some wealth themselves or started a business. So if there's a startup or, dental practice, or there's a big 401k or, something like that, you think you want to get some clarity about what that means. And of course, the third group are people who've been married before or who have children from previous relationships and want to protect those children and also protect their obligation to those children, because you could have committed yourself to something in your divorce agreement that you can't then that then the laws around marriage and divorce conflict with, and you want to make sure that you're really in the clear and that you've got those two kind of lanes separated. So I'll breathe here for a minute.
No, it's great. I was going to be like, preach about getting your stuff sorted ahead of time. So thank you. Yes, that is the reason that I see lots of clients, is because we didn't talk about finances. We didn't talk about budgets. We didn't talk about kids. We didn't talk about how we're going to co-parent, all the things, my little junior therapist. Yes, you are 100% clear. I wish that, even if the prenup conversation led to the conversation that you're talking about, how beneficial would that be? That would be like a mediation, right? We love each other. We are not saying that life isn't going to be romantic, but we're also being clear that there's going to be real things that enter into our world. And so I love this idea that, do you have something that could potentially be complicated? Is the prenup pushing the conversation? Great. If you end up not having one, you don't really need one, or whatever you decide to do, you have to have those conversations, because you are correct. Every relationship is going to end in some way, shape, or form, and you have to prepare for that. Right. So I love that. So I took away, if your family has money, there's probably going to need to be some conversation about it. If you've got kids or assets or businesses or things that could get complicated, let's just have the conversation now. I'd rather you do it while you love each other than when you're like, the average couple waits 6 years before they come to couples therapy. And sometimes that means they're on the way to your office. Right. I'd rather us have the conversations at the beginning when we still have fondness and adoration for each other.
Absolutely. It's so much better to do it in a loving way than do it in an angry way. And even if it brings up fears and feelings of that you might not love in the moment, it's still, those feelings are there. And to be able to work them through in a respectful and loving way, when you're feeling respectful and loving, that's the time to do it.
Okay. So curiosity question. I'm seeing an increase of clients coming in to separate and divorce now post-COVID. Is that transitioning into your offices as well?
Yeah, I think that anecdotally, and I've been doing this a long time, as you mentioned in the intro, my experience over time is that when there's a crisis, people who can stand it stay together until the crisis is over. So 9/11, the Great Recession, and now the pandemic, if it feels more dangerous out of the marriage than it does in the marriage, people are going to stay in the marriage until that shifts and it feels more dangerous in the marriage. For us, we saw a lot of, and this goes along with my theory, high conflict divorces during the pandemic. So people who just couldn't take it no matter what, right, or would go through the divorce during the pandemic. But now the people who've been kind of white knuckling it through the pandemic and just like are now that things are calming down, are like, all right, now let's take another path.
Yeah, they didn't have their traditional coping skills to help. There's no weekends with the girlfriends in Palm Springs. There's no going to the gym. There's no happy hour after work. And so, yeah, some of these couples are just like, let me just get through this and then busting into your doors, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay. So important piece of advice for couples getting ready to go into the divorce proceedings. How do I plan this? If I've decided in my therapist's office that we're going to do this maturely and we're going to uncouple consciously, how do they make their blueprint to come see you, and like, what are they preparing to do?
Yeah, well, I think just to go back to something I said a few minutes ago is I think that to research the way in which they're going to make those decisions, right? So, and if you think about what the statistics I just talked about a little bit ago, it's not really a question of whether or not you're going to settle, it's how. Mm-hmm. And so do you think that mediation might work? And in mediation, the couple sits together with a mediator who is maybe a lawyer, but not a lawyer for one against the other or the other against the first, is there to really facilitate the conversations, identify the information that needs to be gathered, help them gather the information, talk about what's important with them, generate options, then test the options against what's possible and against what's important, and fashion a resolution. And oftentimes, a lot of that work is done by the couple themselves with the help of the mediator, and lawyers are present, sometimes in the room, sometimes outside the room, but they're not leading those kinds of conversations. That works great for people who feel like they have a reasonably level power dynamic, meaning both people have the ability to talk and be heard. They might not agree, they might fight, they might be angry at the other. Nobody expects them to hold hands and sing Kumbaya while they go through this. So let's be clear about that. But that they really do have the ability and the desire to work this out themselves on their own criteria that will make sense with them, with some support, but not a tremendous amount of support. Then, there's collaborative law for people who like that idea, right? But feel like, I'd really like to have a friend in the room. I'd really like to have a support. I'd like to have someone there to watch my back and not let me sell myself out or inform me that the law says something different. And, do I really want to do that, without getting something back for it, and to help manage the negotiation and to work in an interdisciplinary way with a mental health professional who works as a family specialist and keeps an eye on the dynamic, not necessarily relying on the lawyers for that, and a financial neutral. So that can be really supportive for people too. Or people are like, you know what, I've made this decision. There's no way I can get my spouse off the couch. I need to do something a little bit more aggressive or assertive, or I'm in danger, I need an order of protection or something like that, in which case, yeah, you're heading toward using the court system in a, dare I say, judicious way, where you're really picking the elements of what you want and moving. If you have to go all the way to trial, all right, you'll do that, but you're really thinking through and working with your lawyer to make the most thoughtful and proactive decisions that you possibly can do. I mean, I think those are the choice. That's the biggest thing, is the choice. And then again, to prepare and think about, again, hopefully with your therapist or someone who's a close friend, really what is important and what are the things that you really need and what are the things that you want and where are you just being reactive. And this comes up a lot in thinking about the family home. A lot of times people will be like, well, I'm staying here, I'm staying in the homestead, the family residence, the marital residence, whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. But that's not always a great idea. It's not always a great idea financially, because it can be a lot more financially problematic to hold on to a residence with one person, even when you have support coming in, as it was when there were two of you. And it's definitely not as financially doable to maintain your lifestyle when you're living apart as it was when you're living together. But it's also not so good, and again, in your department, psychologically necessarily. If you're going to walk around the house and it's going to be like, all right, this is where my husband's clothes were, this is where his TV was on the wall and now it's not there, like is that, you got to really ask yourself, is that something you want to go through, or do you want to find a new space for yourself and your kids that's yours, that you own, it's 100% fashioned and formed and made by you, and there are no kind of hangover memories there for any of you.
A symbolic cleansing, like this is that milestone, and there's lots of change, and it's not necessarily negative, it's a new positive energy space.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big move, and sometimes it can feel like I definitely don't want to do that now, but if you think, oh, I'm going to stay in this space forever, it's something to think about. And those are some of the things I think that people really should be thinking about.
I love it. I heard that there's a team approach when they get to work with you, right? That there's this, I've got this empathetic mentor that's gone through it, but also understands the legal aspect. I can get you an advocate that can help you with your finances. I have an advocate that can help you with your mental health, and you have to be open to change. It's going to be scary. You're in shock, but I have somebody that will walk me through it that's familiar with the process and is being kind and mindful of how it's impacting my life. I feel grateful for your clients that they have you.
Thank you.
Okay, last question, because I know you got lots of things to do. This is something I ask everybody. Katherine, what is your definition of commitment?
Of commitment?
Yeah.
Like in a relationship?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that commitment is about respect for each person's autonomy, as well as the connection that we share. And I don't want to use the word commitment, but desire and action taken on the desire to nurture the relationship and also admire, respect, and appreciate each person's individuality.
Beautiful. Very well said. You are my little junior therapist. So I appreciate this. This has been amazing. And I know it will be helpful for anybody who's listening who either is getting into a relationship and needs to be mindful of the things that we need to prepare for, or those that find themselves in the midst of this, that there's not so much of a scary factor getting an attorney, that you're actually like a real person and that you're going to look out for them. And I'm really grateful that you gave us this time to kind of give us your insight.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. All right. Take good care of yourself. I'll talk to you later.
All right. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been the D-Spot Podcast with Dr. Dana McNeil. To learn more about Dr. Dana's practice, simply visit us at www.danamcneil.com.